In terms of the direct Iranian threat to the UK from the military, it's extraordinarily limited. They don't have missiles that can reach us at the moment. There are some claims they're trying to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, but I think that is very developmental.
The threat of physical attacks by Iran on people living in the UK has increased significantly since 2022. That's the warning that's come from Parliament's intelligence watchdog, which has today published a report outlining the risks Iran poses to Britain's safety. It says the threat from Iran has become persistent and unpredictable and is now comparable with that posed by Russia. Well, Matthew Savill is Director of Military Sciences at RUSI and former head of the MOD's operational policy for the Middle East, and he's with me now. Hello, Matthew.
Good morning.
Is this surprising that the language here is so strong?
No, I mean, I also worked on Iran policy in the National Security Secretariat for a while, and a lot of this looks very familiar. In fact, given the length of time it's taken to produce this report, it was originally finished at the end of 2023. It's likely that the threat is more severe now, as it doesn't take into account recent events in the Middle East and what's happened since the 7th of October attacks on Israel.
And what are we talking about here? Are we talking about Iranian attacks on, Iranian dissidents, Iranian sort of interests that simply happen to be in Britain, or are we talking about an Iranian threat to Britain itself, Britain infrastructure, British interests?
Yeah, well, the report is covering the totality of, if you like, the relationship and the threat from Iran. So it includes the nuclear program and threats in the Middle East and to, UK military forces. But the thing that people have alighted on is the threat in the UK. What's interesting is the report says there, in some respects, the Iranian regime and its intelligence and security organizations don't see themselves as attacking the UK. What they are doing is going after enemies of the regime, and the UK is in some respects collateral damage. And of course, what we have seen is them targeting dissidents, opposition figures, and Iranian journalists that they don't like.
And when it comes to the military threat from Iran, the nuclear threat specifically, I mean, without sort of wishing to overstate it, the last month or two have kind of shown that Iran doesn't even particularly appear to pose that much of a military threat to Israel. So how worried should we be all the way over here?
Well, I mean, in terms of the direct Iranian threat to the UK from the military, it's extraordinarily limited. They don't have missiles that can reach us at the moment. There are some claims they're trying to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, but I think that is very developmental. It is actually the threat to UK deployed forces in the region, both directly, if there was another outburst of war, or from proxies, so terrorism. And then there is the activity of Iranian intelligence and security organizations that spreads out across Europe, again, where they are looking at targets that are dissidents. So they're not necessarily targeting the UK military, but I think we would be unwise to ignore that risk, given the way that relations between the UK and Iran, if you like, wax and wane.
And has there been much evidence of this actually happening? Can we point to actual attacks that have taken place on UK soil that are backed by Iran in some way?
Yes, so we've had a number of cases that have resulted in essentially criminal charges and convictions where people have been obviously the agents of Iranian intelligence organizations, i.e. they are, employed by them or recruited by them. And also there is evidence of cyber activity that by groups that have been essentially identified as either part of the Iranian security system or effectively working on behalf of them. So there is a small but developing body of evidence that in court points to the Iranian system.
Okay, and look, when it comes to, that bigger military threat, how significant is how worried should we be in this country about Iran's growing nuclear capabilities? Following the US backing out of that international agreement in 2018, does that have genuine implications for British national security as well?
Well, the first thing is that the report is written, with a degree of prescience in terms of if we don't deal with the growing nuclear problem, we're going to have an escalation. Well, that has happened. And as it says, the nuclear deal wasn't perfect, but it did actually restrain Iran, and we probably wouldn't be in this situation if the US hadn't pulled out. Where we stand at the moment is it's difficult to know really what's happened to the Iranian nuclear program, but it seems clear that the Israeli and US attacks have done enormous damage to it in terms of their ability to produce new materials, enrich uranium, etc., etc. What we don't have any clarity on, though, is what happened to most of their stockpile of enriched uranium and whether or not they have smaller hidden facilities that would enable them to rush towards a weapon. And indeed, if you're pessimistic, what the recent example has shown is that the Iranians will have drawn the lesson that they need to be like North Korea and actually have a small nuclear weapons capability to deter attacks, rather than, if you like, hover around the threshold and hope that that is a deterrent.
Finally then, Matthew, and drawing all this together, where could and should this lead? Will we be looking at a greater attention being paid by the security service to Iranians and Iranian interests in the UK? Will we be looking at a beefing up of a military presence in the region surrounding Iran? Both of those things?
Well, I think it's threefold. And all of them will be affected by something that runs throughout this report, which is the question of resourcing. The UK has not been blind to Iran-related problems, stretching back 20, 25 years. That's why it invested in diplomacy on the nuclear program, and, similarly when I was in government. But the issue will be, do we have enough military resources to dedicate to the Middle East, and can they play a significant role at the moment? That would appear to be doubtful, given what the Israelis and US have done and what's required. We definitely need to be putting more effort into intelligence coverage and security and intelligence capabilities to deal with the threat on UK soil. But as the report makes clear, that comes at cost of working elsewhere. And we're already doing an awful lot on things like Russia and China, and organized crime competes for some of those resources. And so the challenge will be, does the UK have the ability to put in the necessary resources to deal with an increased threat if it materializes? It doesn't appear that we have enough in place to deal with the current threat.
Understood. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew Savill. That's Matthew Savill there of RUSI, speaking to us about the threat from Iran.